Welcome to Coda Zero Earth. My name is Kate Charlesworth. I'm in Sydney in Australia, and together with my colleague Forbes McGain in Melbourne, we will be co-hosting today's episode. Firstly, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Wherever you are in the world today, we ask that you also take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which you stand. Today we are proud to collaborate with Teleflex, who are supporting this educational event. Teleflex are passionate advocates for advancing the cause of sustainable healthcare and corporate social responsibility in the medical device industry.
So getting our own house in order, in other words, medicine and healthcare and nursing care and allied health and all of the good things that we do from day to day. What's our carbon footprint? Well, it's around 5% of the world's carbon emissions. And I was thinking about what Tim Flannery was just saying, and that's roughly similar to in between maybe all of Japan or all of Russia. And it's quite a significant amount. It's like saying, well, Japan doesn't need to worry or Russia doesn't need to worry. Well, they do need to worry, all we need to worry, we need to do things. So we're big contributors to the climate crisis, and coming from a base of first do no harm, that's a worry to many of us. We also spend a lot of money on procurement. We produce much physical waste. We use lots of single-use plastics, and we really do have a bit of a problem here. So I'd like to explore this a bit further with the team of panelists. Michelle, how do you see the role of healthcare businesses here? You're part of a global industry that provides good things for us. What's been happening in Teleflex heading towards environmental sustainability?
So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for MedTech to really partner with healthcare professionals on sustainability. That certainly wasn't something I fully appreciated when I was at the bedside, but in this role that I'm in today, I see that. Obviously, healthcare professionals are the end users of our products. So you have an incredible opportunity to direct how they're designed and developed and make sure that it's recognized how important sustainability is to you as the consumer of the products. So I think that is just one great example. It's often referenced as product stewardship, and it's basically taking responsibility for the entire life cycle of the product to really look at all ways in which you can minimize the negative impact it would have on the product. So at Teleflex, we are officially started our journey in corporate social responsibility, and all of our policies are being actively include product stewardship. So we are working to be compliant in that area. And we're also taking a hard look at where we can substitute materials that have been designated as hazardous or detrimental to the environment and look for safe alternatives.
Thank you. I think packaging of products themselves is also a significant issue. So not just the plastic device or metal device that you're using, but the packaging of it. What we roughly do know is that for all of healthcare, the interesting thing is that the direct energy use from our either coal or fossil gas-based heating and cooling, for example, of hospitals, there's actually a much bigger carbon footprint that comes from all of the stuff that we buy and the things that we throw away. And as an example with packaging, recently just in Australia, and I know there are similar activities going on in other hospitals, the Australian Packaging Covenant has looked at what we're going to do. And it's quite interesting. There's a plan for a 50% reduction of all packaging being used and a recycling of 50%. So it's quite a dramatic by 2025. And we, recently myself and a few others reached out to healthcare, to the group and sort of said, well, what about healthcare? And they said, yeah, sure. So as an example of where things are happening, Baxter, and I have no vested interest in Baxter, but Baxter Australia and New Zealand certainly been undertaking recycling of medical PVC plastic. It started at Western Health in Australia, and now we've got about 150 hospitals. I know Canada's involved in that as well now, and that's really exciting. So that's good to see what's happening there. I wonder, for example, Omnia, how does this all fit in a country such as Egypt, where I realise there might be very different difficulties with packaging, with recycling, with reducing and reusing equipment that is medical?
Yes, so in Egypt, I think the biggest barrier we face most when it comes to building sustainability within our healthcare facility is really the lack of awareness among the governance of hospitals and healthcare facilities. So the doctors are not aware, as well as the owners of the hospitals, as well as the government. It's not a priority. In Egypt, we have many other priorities, and climate change still does not really go into that area, as well as we also have in our healthcare facilities, especially with COVID, we have recognized how vulnerable and weak they are, and they really were not able to accommodate patients and provide basic healthcare services. And in my university's hospital, for example, which is the biggest, one of the biggest in Egypt, we still have a lack of basic equipment and materials. But at the same time, it's really, for me personally, I believe that investing in sustainable solutions, such as, for example, having LED lamps or autoclaves or heat reflecting paint, or these renewable and these green technologies in healthcare facilities, is a win-win case scenario, a no regrets investment, especially in a country like mine and other NMIC. But again, we need to have this change and this drive and this awareness among the health sector itself to take leadership and ensure environmental sustainability within the healthcare sector.
Thank you. Courtney, in Canada or elsewhere in North America, for example, are there any initiatives that represent practical reduce, reuse, recycle efforts, please?
Yeah, so I think some of the real benefit of this is for us to all move together. And I was talking to Andrea McNeil, who has done a lot of, she was the first person to carbon footprint the Canadian medical system. And so her big thing is to remember that the lowest carbon footprint test is the one you don't do. And so it wasn't conceived in an environmental vein, but we have a Choosing Wisely campaign that has identified a short list of things that we tend to do too much of, for instance, x-rays for lower back pain. And in fact, if we follow the rules and in fact just give the best care, that's efficient care, it's high value care because it doesn't waste our time and it doesn't waste patients' time. And really, it's also super low carbon. Other things that we can do are put a stop order on daily blood work in hospital. Reusing things is a huge opportunity. The infection control lobby, as you know, has really said, sort of struck fear into all of us in terms of reusing things. But really, that's how we got this far as humans. And I was thinking about, things that I've seen done in lower middle income countries. And we used to actually wash our otoscope tips at the project I was on in Djibouti. So in some cases, lower middle income countries are way ahead of us here because they never moved to this super high waste, high turnover model that high income countries have ended up in. And so the Canadian Medical Association in last year's Lancet Countdown brief committed to trying to achieve net zero healthcare by 2050. And as we see similar commitments in the UK and elsewhere, that means that we can act as bulk buyers to influence industry to say, hey, this is the new norm, help us out here. We're not going to buy your stuff unless you make it low carbon.
Thank you. You've really touched on a very important point there about infection prevention, infection control, protecting the planet, protecting the patient, and the default routinely being single use because it's seen as being safer. It is a really important area and one that's going to be an ongoing conversation. I think it's not something that can be sorted out very quickly, but will require ongoing commitment. And I think we need our sisters and brothers in infection prevention to be part of the story here, and for us to reach out to them and say, how can we work together? I'd just like to pick up on, you mentioned United Kingdom, so the National Health Service Sustainable Development Unit and certainly their National Health Service itself being the largest health system as a single body by itself in the world, has already reduced its carbon emissions by about 20% and saved in the order of pounds, about £1 billion. Earlier this month, it committed to being the first carbon zero health system in the world. And there's a long, you could easily find that, anyone out there in the web, it's a long, almost 80-page detailed, credible, quantified plan for setting out how they're going to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040. Courtney, I'll just come back to you briefly there. What does it really mean to be a zero carbon health system?
Well, I just want to say, so that commitment by the NHS is huge. And having spoken with Nick Watts, who's been put in charge of it, he was my boss at the Lancet Countdown. That guy gets stuff done. So the fact that he is there with adequate resources, I think he said 28 people, with this mandate that comes from on high, we should all, Nick does what he says he's going to do. And so we should anticipate that that's where the ball is going, and we should do everything we can to run with him so we can all catch it together. And so I think that what we're aiming for is to make sure that the carbon we do end up using after we've, minimized everything, we can offset somewhere else. So it won't be that we're using 000 carbon, but we've taken it into account and are planting trees somewhere, what have you, to make sure that on the whole, we are doing no harm as we provide care.
Yes. Omnia, how do you think that might look, that approach in a country such as Egypt, that the English national health system has set out for?
I think this is very interesting because I was actually discussing the NHS story with one of the doctors I was working with in my hospital, and they really saw how unbelievable it is and it doesn't make sense. But then when I was explaining to them how this really has a huge return on investment in the future, and if in Egypt, for example, we decided to do that, that return of investment can then be allocated to provide better healthcare services, especially to those who cannot afford it. And in Egypt, we actually passed last year the Universal Health Coverage Bill. So this transition to carbon neutrality can actually help us implement and provide quality healthcare services for everyone, and to actually have a strong healthcare system like the NHS that provides healthcare for all. So after explaining this to the doctor, he felt a bit more convinced and thinking, okay, this is something we might think of in the future. And we hope that this can be part of the sustainability movement that Egypt is going to start.
One conversation at a time, yeah. That's great. That's great. Michelle, tell us, in the US, how are things happening there? I know that it may be more on a state-based approach, but that's all equally important. I certainly know some exciting things happening in various parts of the country. Perhaps fill us in. You're based in Boston.
I am, absolutely. So I'm most familiar with what's happening actually across the medtech industry as it relates to some of the mandates around sustainability disclosures that we are seeing the rise in, that is actually guiding not even just medtech, but really all of industry in a way, I'd say, that has really been emphasized, and interestingly, even more so coming out of the pandemic. I mean, we are constantly seeing headlines around, the importance of having diverse teams addressing this, making sure that, recently I read a study, for example, that sustainability disclosures in industries gone up for S&P 500 companies from 20% in 2011 to 86% in 2018. So it is something that I'd say the public is more concerned about, but as well as the analyst community. And it's increasingly becoming an expectation across all of industry, in a way in which you basically, if you don't participate, you're not going to be able to differentiate yourself. It's the direction things are moving here, and that's very palpable.
Mm. Courtney, just on the infection control and prevention issue, how do you see this unfolding and what would be the best way to approach the issue of the inherent natural tension between trying to protect the patient from healthcare-related infections. I mean, I could see conniptions occurring, as you described, the reuse of the earpiece in a hospital in Australia. I could see people falling on the floor. What do you think could be an approach there?
I think this has to do with evidence and relationships. So we need to do the studies to say, you know, if you take that otoscope tip and you wash it in soapy stuff and you rinse it off and you stick it over there, do people get more external otitis than if you use the new one? That's a study a resident could run.
Yeah.
You know, that is not a complicated study. We can do that. We publish it. Now there's evidence. We need to do that on every single item. So then there's evidence. And then we need to make sure everybody knows what the evidence is. And we need to create those relationships with, as you said, our colleagues in infection control. Andrea McNeil, as you know, is a miracle in terms of getting things done. And she is so good because she's really, really good at reaching out to people and learning what the barriers to action are for them, establishing common understanding. And so much of this has to do with just really, really personal networks and getting things done, and also establishing what I think we have to do. We have the opportunity to do as a result of initiatives like CODA, like the Global Climate and Health Alliance, is to establish those international norms real quick. So instead of having, you know, that 10-year sort of trickle down effect that we always talk about in medical education, not 10 months, do it, you know, do the study. Let's make sure everybody knows it, move on.
The other issue, of course, is this, the great hulking mass of pandemic, the COVID-19. I dress every day in mountains of oil and plastic. And that's just what you do, because that's about infection prevention, and both to myself and to preventing contamination of other patients and other healthcare workers, for example. It's an ongoing discussion. I have never used a reusable gown, for example. They just don't seem to exist in Australia for the purposes of infection prevention. And that in itself has its own issues and worries and difficulties. But I wonder if anyone, Omnia or Michelle or Courtney, have you ever seen a reusable gown for the purposes of infection prevention? Certainly we have them in theatre, but that's just an interesting example of where we've got this disconnect. There is a profound disconnect that we need to work on.
I haven't seen them,
Yeah.
but not anymore. So the ones I have in my head are ones that I saw as a medical student. And then, you know, the drapes were washable when I was a medical student. And then when I was a resident, everything got switched over. And so a lot of this has to do with returning to practices that we had. And if we're washing those in hot water that's produced with electricity that's generated in a renewable way, we can expect that there's very likely a real lowering of footprint. And what I also like about it, as someone who lives 1,600 kilometers or 1,500 kilometers north of our major center, I think a lot about supply chains.
Resilience.
And I think we've had reason to think about supply chains. So if we're reusing things locally, we have to worry a lot less about disruption to PPE supply as a result of needing to cross international borders, which we're likely to see more of as the climate crisis progresses.
Kate, do you have any questions for us, please?
Yeah, Forbes, there's a few questions coming in. I mean, there's a few actually about the NHS, and perhaps just if I could just ask perhaps Courtney, can you just tell us a little bit more about, you know, Forbes has alluded to a 70-page document setting out what they're going to do. Can you just sort of give us the highlights or the overview of that? Because it's not just about LED lights and solar panels. Well, certainly not in England, it's not all just about solar panels. So can you just give us an overview on that, please?
Well, and I know that Nick Watts has spent the last 6 months putting this together. And so really it has to do with taking a look at where the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions are and then decreasing them. And so as we know, supplies are a huge part of it. So sourcing them, and the NHS has already been auditing its carbon footprint, its water footprint, and the proportion, I believe it is, of things that it's been using that are reused as opposed to going to a landfill for 10 years. It has targets as part of the Climate Change Act in the UK. They set every 5 years a target that they have to meet, and the NHS has its own proportion of that. So when you're in the UK, they got stressed out about whether or not they're going to meet their next climate change target as a healthcare system. So they're so far ahead of the rest of us. So this has to do with us auditing our own practice, is, and making sure that we also have targets. So it has, for them, it has to do with like how clean is our electrical supply, making sure it's all as zero carbon as possible before we use it in the hospital. It has to make sure with doing as much reuse as we can. It has to make sure, making sure the buildings are as efficient as possible so that we're not losing heat through cracks. All of those things are part of the plan. But what I think is really important is the commitment, countrywide commitment and adequate resourcing with goals. We know that goal-directed action works in healthcare and it works in the climate emergency as well.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. So there's a bunch of questions really asking, what, as healthcare professionals, what's the most important thing that we can do? What's the bang for our buck? So I might ask the whole panel that. And in this conversation, focusing more specifically on healthcare rather than perhaps broader actions. Is that okay? So Omnia, could I start with you?
Yes. So I think what's really important, and before we become the trusted messengers, we need to promote the message within ourselves, because what we are seeing and what I'm seeing among all the medical students that we work with, all of them say that maybe they care about climate change in their own country, but many of the medical students around them don't. And it's also the same case scenario with healthcare professionals. We really need to increase awareness among the health sector of how climate change is a health crisis and how they have a role, not just a duty towards their patient, but also a duty towards their community and towards the environment on which the health of their community and their patients depends on. So I think it's really important to build the capacity of the health workforce and the health sector so that they can lead by example, and then all the other sectors can follow. Because as we all say, that climate change is a health emergency, and we more than anyone understand the direct and the indirect health impacts of climate change that are now accelerating more than ever. So we have a duty towards promoting that kind of message, advocating for health. And now we also, with COVID, have the opportunity to advocate for our health and the health of the environment to be placed at the center of the post-pandemic recovery.
Thanks, Omnia. And Michelle, from your perspective?
Really, mine's pretty similar to Omnia's. I mean, every healthcare professional, if they showed up in their professional life with a commitment to advocating for products and a willingness to participate in a forum, whether that's decision making around purchasing, whether that's educating your peers, whether that's participating in the development of new products, to really be assured that the products being produced are going to have the minimal impact, negative impact on the environment, that renewable energy programs are part of the companies in which you do business. I feel like there's a tremendous opportunity to move the needle here.
Courtney?
Yeah, thanks. I have found that teams get built fastest when you give people a target. So I actually wrote a paper on this target-based change making for a healthy recovery. It was in the Lancet Planetary Health. But for the longest time, I was asking people to help, do rounds at your hospital. And then I had 2 people to talk to. And then I said, let's try to get the Canadian Medical Association to divest from fossil fuels. And all of a sudden, people's eyes lit up and everybody's strategizing. And then they had to learn the thing to know to make the argument. So when we think about how we teach medical students, the all problem-based learning, right? I think that model works best in this area. So that same paper, and as part of the CODA process, we're creating a list of different targets at what's called the micro level, so personal level, practice your own life, meso level, departmental, getting rid of anesthetic gases, et cetera, and larger levels, national, advocating for gas phase out, for coal power phase out. Really, it's that group-based work that gets people off the couch. And so I think moving from an information deficit model of change, which is I'm going to tell you things and then you're going to do something, to a hey, let's do this thing model of change is really the key change we need to make right now to get things done.
Tim Flannery, is there any, I know you don't work in the healthcare sector, but is there anything today that surprised you about the health sector's carbon footprint or what's going on, or any observations that you would make?
Oh, well, look, I'm not an expert, Kate, on the sector at all, but what I have heard is so much wisdom about how to move forward. And I would just add to that, the health healthcare workers have so much respect in the community. They really are natural leaders. They have a natural authority. And here in this country, we saw in March when the COVID pandemic was really reaching a peak and the number of infections was doubling every 4 days, our Chief Medical Officer briefed the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister called a pandemic 2 weeks before the WHO did, and enacted a whole series of very difficult decisions, economically impactful decisions. So if the healthcare sector can leverage that trust and authority they have in ways that Courtney and others have talked about, I think it will be a huge contribution.
Can I just follow up on that? I mean, as you've just described, this really appropriate response to the evidence that was being presented to them for COVID, but we haven't seen the same thing from the government, at least in this country, on climate change. Why do you think that is?
Oh, look, I don't have a good answer for that. I think there's probably 25 climate skeptics in the government who are holding the entire nation to ransom. But why that is and how it's funded and done, I don't know.
Courtney or Michelle, do you have a perspective on that issue? Why did we have such an appropriate response in so many cases on COVID, but not the same on the climate crisis?
Well, I think that when COVID first arrived, Tim's right. There was no anti-COVID lobby, especially initially. And then we also had this structure within governments where our chief medical officers of health have a legal role and a legal advisory role. We don't have that with climate change in the same way in most countries. The UK probably comes closest. And so, and what's difficult is that what public health docs tell me is that they're under pressure. So say they get hired by a government that then wants to start a coal plant. Now they're like, oh, gee, like coal's going to cause a lot of dust from air pollution. But if they say that, they're really worried they're going to get fired. And so that's one of the reasons why, even though this is a public health emergency, there's a huge need for clinicians to take action because we're a lot more independent. We have the freedom to speak in a way that public health doesn't.
Thanks. Michelle, is there anything that you wanted to add on that issue?
Just that, I agree certainly with what you just said, Courtney. People drive change. And I think what you just said about healthcare providers is really relevant. As a large multinational company, one of the things that we consider too is employee recruitment and retention. The next generation cares about the climate. They want to work in an organization that they feel like is making a difference. So there's a multitude of factors to consider here, but I think that is certainly one that is relevant to all of this in terms of what is going to actually reshape the way we, as corporations, we approach things, and what makes the environment so a particular focal area for us now in a way that we haven't seen before.
Thanks, Michelle. Sorry, Forbes, I've held you up. I'll let you move on to conversation 4.